The morning sun cut through the warehouse windows at Meridian Logistics, casting long shadows across the loading dock where James Connors guided a forklift between towers of palletized freight. His movements were precise, economical, the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice or something deeper. He wore the same faded work shirt as every other dock worker, steel-toed boots scuffed from concrete floors, a reflective vest that had seen better days. Nothing about him stood out. That was the point. James was 41 years old, a single father who had learned to disappear in plain sight. His hands, rough from loading and unloading countless shipments, moved across the forklift controls with an almost mechanical grace. The other workers joked that he could stack a pallet blindfolded, and they were not far from wrong. What they did not know was that those same hands had once gripped the stick of an F-18 Super Hornet at 30,000 feet, pulling 7 Gs in a combat turn over hostile airspace. That was another life, another man. Now his life revolved around a 9-year-old girl named Sophie who waited for him every evening at the apartment complex 3 miles away. Sophie had type 1 diabetes, the kind that required constant monitoring, insulin pumps, emergency supplies, and the kind of vigilance that never slept. Her mother had died when Sophie was 4, complications during what should have been a routine surgery. One moment James had a wife and a co-pilot in the journey of raising their daughter. The next moment he was alone, standing in a hospital hallway, trying to understand how a world could change so completely in the space of a heartbeat. He left the Navy 6 months later, turned down a promotion to commander, walked away from a career that had defined him since he was 22 years old. His commanding officer had called him a fool. His squadron mates had called him brave. James did not care what they called him. He cared about being home when Sophie's blood sugar dropped in the middle of the night. He cared about making breakfast before school. He cared about being present in a way the Navy would never allow. So he took a job at Meridian Logistics, entry-level, forklift operator. The pay was modest, but the hours were predictable, and predictable was everything when you were the only thing standing between your daughter and a medical emergency. He never complained, never asked for more, never told anyone why a man with his precision, his calm under pressure, his almost supernatural ability to anticipate problems before they happened, was content to spend his days moving boxes. The warehouse floor was cold this morning, the industrial heaters fighting a losing battle against the January chill. James finished his stack, checked the manifest, and walked toward the break room. He passed a group of younger workers gathered around someone's phone, laughing at a video. One of them, a kid named Danny, who was barely 22 and already convinced he understood everything about the world, looked up as James passed. "Hey, Connors," Danny called out. "You ever fly a plane or something?" "The way you drive that forklift, man, it's like you're landing on a carrier." The other workers laughed. James allowed himself a small smile. "Just got good at it," he said. "Practice." Danny shook his head. "Nah, there's something else. You're too calm, like nothing rattles you. My uncle was in the army. He had that same look." James said nothing. He walked into the break room, poured himself a cup of coffee that was more bitter than brown, and sat at a table near the window. From his pocket, he pulled a worn photograph, edges soft from handling. Sophie at the beach last summer, grinning at the camera, her insulin pump visible on her hip like a small technological badge of courage. He traced her smile with his thumb. In his other pocket, he carried something he never showed anyone. A challenge coin, heavy and worn, embossed with the insignia of Strike Fighter Squadron 103, the Jolly Rogers. On the back, engraved words that haunted him still. Lieutenant Commander James Connors, call sign Ghost, Operation Phantom Shield. The coin was scratched, dented from years of being carried close. It was all he had left of a man he used to be. The break room door opened. Frank, the shift supervisor, a man in his 60s who had worked at Meridian for 30 years, stepped inside. He was a veteran himself, though he rarely talked about it. But sometimes James caught Frank watching him with a knowing look, the kind of recognition that passed between men who had served. "You're on the executive floor today," Frank said quietly. "CEO wants all hands visible for some investor walkthrough. Big presentation. They want the operation looking sharp. James nodded. He did not like the executive floor. Too many eyes, too many questions, too much proximity to people who saw workers as numbers on a spreadsheet. But he did his job. That was all he had ever done. The executive floor of Meridian Logistics was a different world from the warehouse. Glass walls, polished floors, the kind of aggressive modernity that announced money and ambition. James stood near a display of the company's shipping network, a map with blinking lights showing global routes, feeling distinctly out of place in his faded work clothes among the suits. Julia Winters had taken over as CEO 8 months ago, the youngest person to ever hold the position at Meridian. She was 34, Harvard MBA, a reputation for ruthless efficiency that had followed her from 3 previous companies. The board had brought her in to fix what they called operational bloat, which meant cutting costs, cutting jobs, and cutting anyone who did not fit her vision of a lean, mean logistics machine. James had seen her exactly twice in his 2 years at the company, both times from a distance. Both times she had been flanked by assistants, moving through the building like a cold front, leaving nervous whispers in her wake. The workers called her the Ice Queen behind her back, and not affectionately. Today she was leading a group of investors through the facility, explaining metrics and margins, gesturing at screens filled with numbers that meant profit for some and pink slips for others. Her voice carried across the floor, sharp and precise. "We have reduced operational redundancy by 18%, Julia was saying, while simultaneously increasing throughput capacity. The key is eliminating inefficiency at every level, no wasted motion, no wasted personnel." James kept his head down, moving a display palette into position as instructed. He had learned long ago that visibility was dangerous in corporate environments. Be useful, be invisible, go home to your daughter. But then Sophie's school called. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Riverside Elementary. His heart clenched. He answered immediately, turning away from the executive group, his voice low. "This is James Connors. Mr. Connors, this is Nurse Patterson. Sophie's blood sugar is dropping rapidly. She's conscious, but we need you to bring her emergency glucagon kit. The one at school expired and the replacement hasn't arrived yet. I'm on my way." He ended the call. His mind was already calculating. 20 minutes to the school. 10 minutes to stabilize her if he got there in time. Every second mattered. He had seen what happened when blood sugar dropped too fast. Seizures, unconsciousness, brain damage, death. He started moving toward the exit, fast but controlled. He had to find Frank, get clearance, get out. But Julia Winters was blocking the path. She stood with her investor group directly between James and the exit, pointing at something on a display screen. James hesitated for a fraction of a second, then altered course, trying to slip past the group along the far wall. Her voice stopped him. "You there? Worker." James paused, turned. Julia was looking directly at him, her eyes cold and appraising. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" "Family emergency," he said, keeping his voice level. "My daughter. I need to leave." Julia's expression did not change. "We're in the middle of an investor presentation. No one leaves the floor until it's complete. That's policy." "With respect, ma'am, my daughter has a medical condition. She needs me now." "And with respect," Julia replied, her voice carrying across the floor so that every investor, every worker, every assistant could hear, "Your daughter's medical condition is not the company's problem. If you cannot commit to being present when you're needed, perhaps you should reconsider your employment here." James felt the heat rise in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in years. In the cockpit, he had learned to suppress emotion, to think clearly when missiles were locking and alarms were screaming. He drew on that training now. "I am asking for 15 minutes to ensure my child does not go into diabetic shock, and I am telling you that this company operates on reliability." Julia turned to her investor group, gesturing at James as though he were an exhibit. "This is exactly the kind of attitude we've been eliminating, personal issues superseding professional obligations, no accountability, no discipline." A murmur rippled through the investors. Some looked uncomfortable, others nodded along. Danny, the young worker from earlier, stood nearby. He smirked. Guess some people think their problems are more important than the job. Another worker chimed in. My kid gets sick, I don't just walk out. James said nothing. His hands were steady. His face was blank. But inside, something cold was uncoiling. Julia stepped closer, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Let me be clear, Mr. Connors. You can walk out that door right now if you want, but if you do, you won't have a job to come back to. She paused, letting the words land. Your choice. James looked at her. He saw the ambition in her eyes, the need to project strength in front of her audience. He understood it in a clinical way. She was performing. He was the prop. My daughter's life is not a choice, he said quietly. Then you've made your decision. She turned her back on him, gesturing for security. Please escort this gentleman from the building. He's no longer employed here. Two security guards approached. James did not resist. There was no point. Every second he spent arguing was a second Sophie did not have. As the guards led him toward the door, he heard the whispers behind him. Unbelievable. Who does he think he is? Good riddance. Frank caught his eye from across the room. The old supervisor's face was tight with something that looked like grief. James walked out of Meridian Logistics with nothing but his phone, his challenge coin, and the knowledge that his daughter needed him. He did not look back. He was halfway to his truck when the sound reached him. At first it was distant, a low rumble that could have been thunder if the sky were not crystal clear. Then it grew, a building roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. James stopped, his head tilted automatically, calculating trajectory, velocity, approach vector. It was instinct. It was muscle memory that years of civilian life had not erased. Then he saw them. Two F-18 Super Hornets, gray and lethal, descending toward the Meridian parking lot in a pattern he recognized immediately. Combat approach, controlled aggression. They came in low, impossibly low, their engines screaming as they roared over the building at barely 500 feet. The sound was apocalyptic. Windows rattled. Car alarms erupted across the lot. Workers who had gathered near the loading dock entrance to watch James's removal now stood frozen, staring at the sky in disbelief. The jets pulled up in a steep climb, afterburners igniting, then banked hard and circled back, settling into a holding pattern directly over the facility. James knew what this meant. He had executed similar patterns himself years ago, providing air cover for extraction operations. These jets were not passing through, they were waiting. Behind him, the executive doors burst open. Julia Winters emerged with her investors, her face a mixture of confusion and alarm. What in the world is happening? No one answered her, because at that moment a Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the tree line, moving fast toward the parking lot. It descended rapidly, controlled and precise, touching down 50 yards from where James stood. The rotor wash sent debris swirling, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The side door slid open before the rotors had even begun to slow. A woman in navy dress uniform stepped out, silver eagles gleaming on her collar, captain rank. Behind her, two enlisted personnel in combat utilities. She walked directly toward James, her stride purposeful and unhesitating. When she reached him, she stopped, and to the shock of everyone watching, she saluted. Lieutenant Commander Connors, she said. I'm Captain Reynolds, Naval Air Systems Command. We have a situation that requires your immediate expertise. James did not return the salute. He stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. I'm not Lieutenant Commander anymore, he said quietly. I'm just a father whose daughter needs him right now. Captain Reynolds lowered her salute, but her expression did not waver. Sir, I understand, and I would not be here if we had any other option. She paused. Ghost Squadron needs you. Your country needs you. The words hung in the air. Behind them, Julia Winters had pushed to the front of the gathered crowd. Her face had gone pale. Lieutenant Commander, she whispered. Ghost Squadron. An older investor beside her, a man with the bearing of someone who had seen military service, leaned in. Ghost Squadron was a classified strike unit, he murmured. Flew deep cover missions during 3 different conflicts. Their operations saved thousands of coalition lives. His voice dropped, and they suffered losses that were never made public. Captain Reynolds continued, ignoring the audience. Sir, 45 minutes ago we lost contact with a training flight off the coast. 2 F-18, 4 souls, engine failure on 1 aircraft, mid-air collision during emergency maneuvers. 1 pilot ejected successfully and has been recovered. The other 3 went down with the damaged aircraft. She pulled out a tablet, showed him a screen filled with flight data, radar signatures, ocean coordinates. The aircraft is in shallow water, but the beacon is showing anomalous signals. Standard rescue protocols are failing. We've lost communication with the downed pilots, but biomonitors suggest at least 2 are still alive, trapped in the wreckage. James stared at the data. His mind was already working, processing information at a speed that had nothing to do with forklift operation. Why me? Because you wrote the emergency extraction protocols we're trying to use. Because you survived 3 ejections and 1 ocean landing. Because you understand the F-18 systems better than anyone currently active. She met his eyes, and because Lieutenant Peterson is one of the downed pilots, Brian Peterson. He was your wingman during Phantom Shield. His call sign was Joker. James felt the world shift beneath him. Brian, the kid who had been 23 years old during their last mission together, who had trusted James with his life on a night when everything had gone wrong, who had held James's hand in the hospital after they lost 2 squadron mates to an engine failure they could not have predicted. Brian had stayed in, had gotten married, had 2 kids now, James remembered. Christmas cards with photos. James turned toward his truck. I have to get my daughter first. Captain Reynolds nodded. We can send someone. No, I go myself. Then I help. Sir, time is critical. Then we move fast. He started walking. Captain Reynolds fell into step beside him, speaking rapidly into a radio. The helicopter's rotors began spinning up again. Behind them, the crowd from Meridian stood in stunned silence. Julia Winters had not moved. Her face was blank, processing information that did not fit any model she understood. Frank, the old supervisor, stepped up beside her. That man you just fired, he said quietly. He flew 97 combat missions. He has a Navy Cross, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and 2 Bronze Stars. He turned away from the ocean of frozen faces, and he was standing right here in your warehouse, moving boxes, because his little girl needed him to be home every night. Julia watched the helicopter lift off, banking hard toward the east. The F-18s above adjusted their pattern, falling into escort formation. She did not know what to feel. She was not sure she was capable of feeling anything at all. The helicopter touched down in the school parking lot 7 minutes later, scattering teachers and children who had gathered outside for afternoon recess. James was out before the skids had fully settled, running toward the building with a speed that surprised even Captain Reynolds. He found Sophie in the nurse's office, pale and trembling but conscious. Her teacher stood nearby, looking terrified. The nurse was monitoring her blood sugar with equipment that looked ancient. Daddy. Sophie's voice was weak, but her eyes brightened when she saw him. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. He pulled the emergency glucagon kit from his bag, the one he always carried, the one he had grabbed from his truck before boarding the helicopter. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he administered the injection, then held Sophie close, monitoring her breathing, counting the seconds until the medication took effect. Captain Reynolds waited at the door, saying nothing. She understood priorities. She had children of her own. 5 minutes later, Sophie's color began to return. Her blood sugar stabilized. She looked up at her father with the absolute trust that only a child can offer. Daddy, there are helicopters outside. I know, baby. Are you going somewhere? James hesitated. He looked at his daughter, at her brave face, at the insulin pump on her hip that was both her lifeline and her limitation. He thought about Brian, somewhere in the ocean, trapped and running out of time. He thought about the choice he had made 4 years ago, walking away from everything to be here for moments exactly like this one. "Daddy has to help someone," he said finally. "Someone who helped me once, a long time ago. He's in trouble and I'm the only one who can help him." Sophie's eyes were serious. "Is he your friend?" "Yes." "Then you should go." She squeezed his hand. "I'll be okay. Mrs. Patterson is here, and you'll come back. I will always come back." He kissed her forehead, then turned to the nurse. "Her aunt is listed as emergency contact. She can be here in 20 minutes. I'll call her from the air." The nurse nodded, still looking shell-shocked by the military helicopter visible through the window. James walked to the door, then stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the challenge coin, the one he had carried for years, the one that represented everything he had been and everything he had given up. He pressed it into Sophie's hand. "Hold on to this for me. It's important." Sophie looked at the coin, at the skull and crossbones emblem, at her father's name etched into the metal. "What is it?" "It's a promise." James's voice was rough, a promise that some things are worth fighting for. Then he was gone, running across the parking lot, climbing into the helicopter, lifting off into a sky that had once been his home. Captain Reynolds briefed him during the flight to the coast, where a Navy destroyer waited to serve as the command center for the rescue operation. The situation was worse than the initial report suggested. The collision had occurred during a routine training exercise. One aircraft had suffered catastrophic engine failure, likely a compressor stall that cascaded into complete power loss. The pilot had attempted to restart and failed. Emergency ejection was initiated, but something went wrong with the timing. The second aircraft, flying close formation, had been unable to avoid the debris field. One pilot ejected clean. Brian Peterson and 2 others went down with the wreckage. The aircraft had impacted in relatively shallow water, about 60 feet deep, which was both blessing and curse, shallow enough for the pilots to potentially survive if trapped in an air pocket, shallow enough for rescue divers to reach them. But the wreckage was unstable, shifting with the current. Standard rescue protocols required stabilization before extraction, and the protocols were not working. "Because I wrote those protocols for a different airframe," James said, studying the data on Reynolds's tablet. "The Super Hornet's fuselage structure is different. The stress points are in different locations. Your divers are trying to brace the wrong sections. Can you guide them from here?" "No." James looked up. "I need to be on site. I need to see the wreckage configuration with my own eyes. You want to go in the water. I'm the only one who knows where to look." Captain Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "You've been out of active service for 4 years. I've been out of uniform for 4 years. He met her eyes, but I never stopped being a pilot. The destroyer appeared on the horizon, gray and imposing against the blue water. As they approached, James could see the flurry of activity on deck. Rescue helicopters, diving equipment, medical teams standing by, the full machinery of military emergency response, and circling above, the 2 F-18 that had escorted them from Meridian, standing watch, protecting their own. They landed on the destroyer's deck, and James was immediately surrounded by personnel. Some recognized him, older officers who had served during his active years. Word had spread through the command structure with military efficiency. Ghost was back. A young lieutenant approached with diving equipment. "Sir, we've got your gear ready." James stripped off his civilian clothes without hesitation. Underneath, he wore a simple white undershirt and work pants. Nothing military, nothing official. Just a 41-year-old man with scars on his shoulders from ejection harness straps preparing to go into the water. The dive chief briefed him on conditions, current, visibility, the exact position of the wreckage. James listened, asked 3 questions that made the chief pause and reconsider his entire approach, then turned toward the water. "Wait." The voice came from the communication station. An ensign looked up, face pale. "We're getting audio from the wreckage. Faint. But there's a voice." James froze. "Put it on speaker." Static filled the air. Then, through the noise, a voice. Weak, strained, but unmistakable. "This is Joker. Position compromised. Taking on water. Estimate 10 minutes of air remaining. If anyone can hear me, I've got 2 injured pilots in here. I'm not leaving them." He paused, coughed. "Tell my kids I love them." James grabbed the radio from the ensign. "Brian, it's Ghost." Silence. Then, through the static, a sound that might have been a laugh. "Ghost? Jimmy Connors? What the hell are you doing here?" "Coming to get you. Same as always." "Brother, I thought you were out, living the quiet life, changing diapers and stuff." "My daughter's 9 now. She doesn't wear diapers anymore." Another cough. "How's she doing?" "She's waiting for me to bring you home." Silence on the line. Then Brian's voice, steadier now. "Then you better hurry up." James handed the radio back to the ensign and walked to the diving platform. 2 rescue divers flanked him, professionals who had trained for exactly this kind of operation, but they both looked at James with something like awe. "Sir," one of them said, "we'll follow your lead." James nodded. Then he pulled his mask into place, bit down on his regulator, and dropped into the water. The descent was cold and dark, visibility limited to maybe 20 feet. James oriented himself immediately, finding the wreckage by following the faint glow of emergency beacons. The aircraft lay on its side, crumpled but largely intact. A miracle, really. At this depth, at this impact angle, there should have been nothing left to find. He circled the wreckage, assessing. The standard protocols called for bracing the forward fuselage near the cockpit before attempting extraction. But James could see immediately why that was failing. The forward section was compromised, buckled inward from the collision. Any pressure applied there would collapse the air pocket where Brian and the others were trapped. He signaled to the divers, "Not there. Follow me." He swam toward the tail section to a point near the engine housing that looked to untrained eyes like the worst possible place to apply force. But James knew this aircraft, knew it the way he knew his own body. The tail section was reinforced for carrier landings. It was the strongest part of the airframe. He positioned himself and gestured for the divers to begin setting the stabilization braces. They hesitated, looking at each other. Everything they had trained for said this was wrong. "Trust me," James signaled. They trusted him. 10 minutes later, the wreckage was stable. James swam to the cockpit section, found the emergency release that was invisible to anyone who had not studied F-18 schematics for years, and pulled. The canopy separated. Air bubbles rushed up. Inside, 3 figures, Brian in the pilot's seat, conscious but weakening. 2 junior pilots behind him, one unconscious, one bleeding from a head wound but alert. James reached in, grabbed Brian's harness, and began to pull. The ascent was controlled, careful. One diver took each of the injured junior pilots. James held Brian, watching his friend's face, watching for signs of decompression sickness, watching for the moment when the cold and the pressure and the fear would finally overwhelm a man who had been holding on through sheer willpower. They broke the surface together. The deck of the destroyer erupted. Medical teams rushed forward. Helicopter rotors spun up for immediate evacuation to the hospital ship waiting nearby. But for one moment in the chaos, Brian grabbed James's arm. 4 years, Brian said, his voice raw. 4 years you've been driving a forklift or something, and you still came. James said nothing. He did not need to. Brian was loaded onto a stretcher. As they carried him toward the helicopter, he raised one hand, formed a shaky fist, ghost for life. James returned the gesture. Then he stood on the deck, soaking wet, surrounded by military personnel who were looking at him like he had just descended from myth, and felt something he had not felt in 4 years. He felt like himself. The news spread fast. Cell phone videos from Meridian's parking lot had already gone viral, showing the F-18’s roaring over the building, the Black Hawk landing, the mysterious warehouse worker being addressed as Lieutenant Commander. Within hours, reporters had pieced together the story. Navy hero working as forklift operator, fired by corporate CEO, returns to save former squadron mates. The narrative was irresistible. It was everywhere. At Meridian headquarters, Julia Winters sat in her office watching the coverage on multiple screens. Her phone had not stopped ringing. The board chairman, investors, media requests. Everyone wanted answers. On one screen, a news anchor was interviewing a retired admiral. Lieutenant Commander Connors was one of the finest combat pilots of his generation. His decision to leave the Navy was widely mourned in the aviation community, but those of us who knew him understood. His wife had passed. His daughter needed him. He made the choice that any good father would make. On another screen, they were showing the security footage from that morning. Julia herself standing in front of James, gesturing dismissively, calling for security. The timestamp was clearly visible. 12 minutes before the helicopters arrived. Her assistant knocked tentatively. "Ma'am, there's a Captain Reynolds here from the Navy. She's requesting to meet with you." Julia closed her eyes. "Send her in." Captain Reynolds entered with the kind of quiet authority that made Julia's own executive presence feel like a cheap imitation. She did not sit. "Ms. Winters, I won't take much of your time. I'm here to collect the personal effects that Mr. Connors left behind when he was terminated this morning." Julia gestured toward a box on her desk. She had already gathered everything: a worn jacket, a lunch bag with a peanut butter sandwich inside, a photograph of a little girl at the beach. Captain Reynolds picked up the photograph, looked at it for a long moment. "Do you know who this is?" "His daughter, Sophie. Sophie Connors is 9 years old. She has type 1 diabetes. Her mother died when she was 4. Reynolds set the photograph down. Lieutenant Commander Connors walked away from a career that most pilots would kill for, because Sophie needed a father who would be there every night, every morning, every emergency. This morning you fired him for wanting to save his daughter's life. Reynolds's voice was level, without accusation, which somehow made it worse. And then, an hour later, he saved 3 of my pilots, one of whom has 2 children of his own who would have lost their father today. She picked up the box of personal effects. "I'm not here to judge you, Ms. Winters. That's not my job. But I want you to understand something. The man you laughed at this morning has given more to this country than most people will ever know. And he did it without ever asking for recognition." She walked to the door, then paused. "He did ask for one thing today, 15 minutes to help his daughter, and you told him his child's life was not the company's problem." Reynolds left. Julia sat alone in the silence of her office, surrounded by screens showing her own face, her own words, her own catastrophic failure of judgment. She thought about leadership, about strength, about what it meant to have power and how easily that power could become cruelty. She had fired a man who was everything she pretended to be: disciplined, selfless, strong under pressure, and she had done it to prove a point that meant nothing to anyone but her own ego. The next morning, Julia drove to the address she had found in James's personnel file, a modest apartment complex on the unfashionable side of town. The kind of place where people lived because they had to, not because they wanted to. She found the right unit, stood outside the door for a long moment, then knocked. The door opened. James stood there, still in civilian clothes, looking exactly as he had looked at the warehouse. Unremarkable, invisible. Except now Julia knew what lay beneath the surface: Ms. Winters, Mr. Connors. She hesitated. "May I come in?" He studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. The apartment was small but clean, functional. On the wall, a single-framed photograph of a woman who must have been his wife, young and beautiful, holding a baby. "Sophie was at school," James said, following her gaze. "She's doing fine. Blood sugar stabilized." "Good. That's good." Silence stretched between them. Julia had rehearsed a speech, something about corporate policy and emotional decisions and the complexity of leadership. It all felt hollow now. "I came to apologize," she said finally. James waited. "Not because the news made me look bad, not because the board is pressuring me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Because I was wrong. I was cruel. and I am genuinely deeply sorry. James nodded slowly. Okay, okay. I accept your apology. Julia blinked. She had expected resistance, anger, the chance to be refused, which would at least be a clear consequence she could understand. That's it? What else should there be? I fired you, in front of everyone. I called security. I said your daughter's life was not my problem. You did. And you just accept my apology? James moved to the small kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. Ms. Winters, I've seen what happens when people hold on to anger. I've seen what it costs. He sat down at the small table, gestured for her to join him. I spent 20 years in combat aviation. I lost friends. I lost my wife. I lost the career I built my identity around. He looked at her directly. I don't have room for grudges. I only have room for what matters. Julia sat. The coffee was weak, made with a cheap machine, but she drank it anyway. What matters to you? Sophie, being the father she deserves. James paused. I made a choice 4 years ago to give up everything else for that. I don't regret it. But you went back. Yesterday. You put on the gear and went into the water because someone needed me, because I could help in a way no one else could. You could have said no. After what I did to you, after everything, you could have told the Navy to find someone else. James smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. Brian Peterson has 2 kids, 10 and 7. Yesterday morning they had a father. Because I went into the water, they still have a father. He shook his head. There was never a choice to make. Julia set down her coffee cup. She thought about her own choices, the relentless drive for efficiency, the belief that strength meant never bending, the conviction that personal problems were weaknesses to be eliminated. I want to offer you your job back, she said, with a raise, a promotion, whatever you want. James was quiet for a moment. I don't want a promotion. Then what do you want? Flexibility. James leaned forward. I want to be able to leave when Sophie needs me without asking permission. I want to be judged by my work, not by the clock. I want to be treated like a human being who has a life outside those warehouse walls. He met her eyes. And I want the same thing for everyone else who works there. Every parent who's afraid to ask for time off. Every person who's one emergency away from losing their job because the system doesn't leave room for life. Julia considered this. It went against everything she had built her management philosophy around. That would require changing the entire operational structure. Yes, the board would resist. Probably, it would cost money, less than you think. James's voice was calm, patient. People who feel valued work harder. People who know their families are protected are more loyal. You're not running a machine, Ms. Winters, you're leading people. Julia sat with that for a long moment. Outside, she could hear children playing in the apartment complex courtyard. Normal life. The kind of life that happened in places where people like her never visited. I spent my whole career believing that compassion was weakness, she said quietly. That you had to choose between being respected and being kind. James shook his head. The strongest people I ever knew were the ones who could be both. Julia looked at him. This man who had flown combat missions, who had pulled his friends from a sinking aircraft, who had walked away from glory to change diapers and pack school lunches. Will you help me? She asked. To change things? James was silent. Then he nodded. For Sophie, for every kid whose parent is afraid to answer the phone at work, for every person who's been told their life doesn't matter as much as the schedule. He stood, extended his hand. Welcome to leadership, Ms. Winters. 6 months later, the Meridian Logistics annual report included an unusual section, not about profits or efficiency metrics, but about people. Turnover had dropped 40%. Productivity was up. Employee satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in company history. Julia Winters stood at a podium presenting the results to the board, but she was not alone. James Connors stood beside her, not as a forklift operator, not as a consultant or an executive, as something harder to define, A partner, an advisor, a conscience. Behind them on the screen, a photograph, Sophie at a company family day, grinning at the camera, surrounded by other children of Meridian employees. The insulin pump still visible on her hip, a challenge coin around her neck on a simple chain, the coin James had given her, the coin she had returned to him that night at the hospital, the coin he had given back to her, finally, when the rescue was complete. "This is yours," she had said. "No," he had replied. "It belongs to all of us now. Everyone who chooses family over glory, everyone who shows up when it matters." Julia concluded her presentation. The board applauded. The numbers were good, the narrative was better. But she knew that none of it mattered as much as the moment 6 months ago when she had sat in that small apartment, drinking weak coffee, and learned what strength actually looked like. Later that evening, James drove home from the office. He still worked at Meridian, though his title had changed several times. People called him the efficiency consultant, which made him smile. He had never cared about efficiency. He cared about people. Sophie was waiting at the apartment doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up when he entered, her face bright. "Daddy, I made the honor roll." He crossed the room, pulled her into a hug. "I'm proud of you." Sophie laughed, then grew serious. "Daddy, the other kids were asking about your coin, the one I wear sometimes." "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was from when you were a hero." James knelt down, eye level with his daughter. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart." Sophie shook her head, her expression stubborn in a way that reminded him painfully of her mother. "Yes, you are. You save people. You saved your friend Brian. You saved his kid's daddy." James felt his throat tighten. That was just one time. Sophie reached out, touched his face with her small hand. "You save me every day." Outside the apartment window, the sun was setting. Golden light spilled across the small kitchen, across the photograph on the wall, across the father and daughter holding each other in the ordinary quiet of an evening at home. James thought about the Navy, about the cockpit, about the roar of engines and the weight of responsibility in the faces of everyone he could not save. Then he thought about this small apartment, this homework on the table, this little girl who saw him not as Ghost, not as Lieutenant Commander, but as Daddy. He had made his choice 4 years ago. He would make it again every day for the rest of his life. That was the real mission, the one that mattered. Not saving the world, but being there for one person who needed him. One person who made every sacrifice worth it. Sometimes we look at people and see only what they show us. The worn clothes, the humble job, the quiet presence in the corner. We judge without asking. We dismiss without understanding. We laugh at those who seem beneath us without ever wondering what they might have given up to be standing where they are. But beneath every ordinary face there is an extraordinary story. A choice someone made, a sacrifice no one saw. A moment when they decided what kind of person they wanted to be. James Connors chose to be a father. He chose bedtime stories over combat missions, school pickups over medal ceremonies, a small apartment over officers' quarters. And when the moment came when someone needed him, he was still everything he had ever been, a warrior, a savior, a man who walked into darkness so others could find their way to light. Julia Winters learned that leadership is not about control, it is about courage. The courage to admit when you are wrong, the courage to see people as they truly are, the courage to build something better than your own ambition. Real strength has never been about dominance, it is about protection, about sacrifice, about showing up for the people who depend on you even when no one is watching. The measure of a person is not found in their title or their paycheck or the fear they inspire. It is found in the choices they make when no one is counting. It is found in the father who walks away from glory to be home for dinner. It is found in the leader who learns to listen. It is found in the moment when someone who has every reason to refuse says yes because someone else needs help. Subscribe if you believe that real heroes never need applause to know who they are.